Well, welcome to our program. My name is Thorin Tritter. I am the Museum and Programming Director at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center, which is located in Glen Cove, New York. I'm excited about our program this evening with the journalist and author Charlie English, who is going to join us from England to talk about his new book, The Gallery of Miracles and Madness, Insanity, Modernism, and Hitler's War on Art. Before we get to the program, however, I do, as I often do, I like to just put in a plug for some of our other upcoming programs. So on Monday, October 4th, I hope you'll join us for a program with the author and photographer Daniel Levin, who has been working with the master violin maker Amnon Weinstein, who is restoring violins that survived the Holocaust. And the presentation is going to focus on some of the 86 violins that have been restored, telling the stories of the objects and the owners in an effort to bring the violins of the Holocaust back to life. So I hope you'll join us for that. I will be back with my next Curator's Corner on Wednesday, October 13th, when I'm going to talk about part of a tea set that we have in our collection that is from Hitler's favorite hotel in Nuremberg. And I'll talk about the tea set, but also about why Nuremberg came to figure so highly in the Nazi activities. And one more program to mention, on Thursday, October 14th, our new Director of Education, Avi Markovitz, is going to give a talk entitled Exploring Jewish Leadership During the Shoah. Drawing on his own research and experience at Yad Vashem, Dr. Markovitz is going to speak about how various types of religious leaders, Jewish religious leaders, responded to the conditions of the ghettos, the Nazi ghettos. You can find more details about all of those programs on our website at www.hmtcli.org, and then click on the events tab. Okay, enough advertisements. Let me turn that off and introduce our guest this evening. I'm pleased to introduce Charlie English. Charlie English is a former journalist for The Guardian, where he held several positions, including arts editor and the head of international news. He is also a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society and the author of two previous books, The Snow Tourist, which explores all manifestations of snow in a book that I saw appropriately described as part travelogue and part history, and his more recent book, The Storied City, about the great archives held in Timbuktu and the 2012 effort to save that collection from Al-Qaeda-linked jihadis. In his new book, he's not talking about snow or about Timbuktu. He weaves together an exploration of the modern art movement of the early 20th century with Hitler's war on art and the Holocaust. It sounds like a lot to cover, and it is, but the book is really a magnificent example of how drawing connections between these different topics help to elucidate all three. Philippe Sands, who was on a program with us a few months back, described this new book by Charlie English as a riveting tale brilliantly told. And coming from Philippe Sands, that's no small accolade. But it is a description that really resonated with me while I read the book, because it did feel like I was pulled along by the narrative, and jumping from different topics sometimes also helped draw me through the material. One more comment before I get to our conversation, and that is to encourage you out there to feel free to raise questions. If you've got a question for Charlie English about this book, about these topics, please use the Q&A function of Zoom, type it in, and we will make sure to get to them. Okay, enough of my comments and introduction. Let's get to our program. So I'm delighted to introduce Charlie English. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thorin. Lovely to be here, virtually here.
Yeah, right. So I mentioned briefly what this book is about, but I always feel like, well, for sure, you should be able to describe it better than me. What's your kind of elevator speech about this book? How do you describe what it is?
Well, I guess my kind of 3 or 4 word description is insanity, modernism, and Hitler's war on art. I mean, it's really a history of the Prinzhorn collection, which is this collection of psychiatric art that was gathered in Heidelberg just after the First World War. And I follow one of the artists in this collection who was in a kind of German psychiatric hospital at Emmendingen, just in the very southwest corner of Germany. and we follow his life really from the moment he's sectioned, if you like, to the point where he becomes a victim of the Nazis. And on that journey, you're right, you cover a kind of immense swathe of early 20th century history. Partly the kind of influence that Prinzhorn and psychiatric art and madness had on modern art, which I think was the first, really interesting bit of the story for me. And then the way that connection between madness and modernism is exploited by the Nazis and by Hitler personally to sort of create a culture war that he then uses to begin the industrial killing of people.
Well, I'd like to get to the various components of those different things, but maybe before we get to that, can I just ask you how you went from snow and Timbuktu to the Holocaust and modern art? What inspired your interest in this topic?
Well, I guess I'm a writer of stories, and I think what appealed to me about Timbuktu was that it was one of the best stories I'd ever come across. And then I came across having completed that, I came across the Prinzhorn collection story, and initially I thought this is a really exciting, it's a kind of triumph of a marginalized group of people in inspiring people like Dali and the surrealists and so on. But then it also, to then sort of cut across the idea of Hitler's ideas about art and culture, I think really made me, I just got a kind of feeling that this was something that I don't think people really knew about in a kind of, most people, obviously some people have been writing about this for a long time, but I think most people out there really don't understand or know about it. And I think it's a really interesting aspect of this story that people really do know, I guess, very well.
I'd like to just read a quote from early on in your book where you kind of set up the importance of the focus of your work. You write, exploring art in the context of National Socialism may seem counterintuitive, even distasteful. What relevance can painting or sculpture have when measured against so many deaths? Aren't Hitler's ideas about culture a distraction from his far more pressing crimes, to which so many words have already been devoted? And you then go on to answer that with the entire book. But can you set that up? Why is it not distasteful to talk about this art? Why is it appropriate to talk about Hitler's views on art?
Because I think as I went on, I realized that it was integral to his ideology and his politics. And I think we have to kind of not understand, but comprehend what this was about and the tools that he used to create this environment in Germany and to get to power. And I think, I feel there's a kind of modern resonance with a lot of this material. I don't know if you felt that, but it seemed to me that, there are a lot of demagogues out there, shall we say, and I think they work in certain ways. And we're in a time of, it seems to me, kind of endless culture wars, and people use culture as a way to kind of promote their political idea, and they try to bring groups of people around to their side by choosing a signifier of culture. And Hitler, I think quite deliberately, chose art as a route to the German people. He could make the case that art was being degenerated, that it was being sort of polluted. That was his whole argument behind it's the same argument behind his war on art and his war on people, is that the Germans were somehow being polluted by foreign, outside, cosmopolitan, Jewish, Bolshevik. There's a list of the same targets across all these subjects. And he could, there were German people who believed that. And I think, in a way, it's a soft target. Most people don't like contemporary art. I mean, if you went out in the street here in London and you said, what do you think of Tracy Emin, Damien Hirst, they'd probably tell you it was rubbish or overpaid, So it's a soft target, and he managed to sort of rally a sort of fascist group around that attack on modernism. So that's my kind of idea.
Let's before we talk more about Hitler's war on art, I'd like to kind of set it up the way you do in the book, with a little talk about more about what was going on in modern art, and particularly how it connected with the Prinzhorn, what became the Prinzhorn collection. And you start talking in the book about Hans Prinzhorn, this German psychiatrist who started to create a collection of art gathered from the asylums throughout Germany in the 1920s. And can you tell us a little more about who he was and why he decided that this was something worthwhile to collect?
Well, Prinzhorn was a kind of a multi-talented, Renaissance, vastly intelligent individual, well-educated. By 1919, which is when he started work at the Heidelberg Psychiatric Clinic, he was already, he had done a doctorate in art history, he'd retrained as a medic. He was also a professionally trained baritone singer, and he was a war veteran. So, I think he was probably in his early 30s at that point, but he'd covered a lot of ground. But I suppose the connection between medicine and art that he had in his background already, and also I should say his one of his wives suffered quite severely with mental illness, and she was in a Swiss sanatorium for some time. So he was touched by these issues, but also had an expertise. And during the war, he met the man who would be the professor at Heidelberg just after the war. And they obviously had this discussion about art and psychosis and what the connection was, because it was something that modern artists were already thinking about, before the war. Expressionists were already kind of exploring the territory. And Prinzhorn said, okay, well, I'll do it, but I want to make this a really big collection of art. I don't want this to be a kind of, just something that we have in Heidelberg. I want to open it up. And so he got to the job and wrote to pretty much all the institutions he could think of in the German world, and also beyond. I mean, in the end, the collection encompassed even pieces, I think, from Japan and the States. And he asked them, to send in the creative materials that patients, inmates were creating in institutions across Western Europe. And, this was a time before antipsychotic drugs. This was a time when people who lived in asylums and psychiatric hospitals had really very little to do. I mean, part of the treatment was to keep them in bed for weeks at a time, and their lives were pretty pointless. I mean, you got released from jail, but you didn't necessarily get released from the asylum. So a lot of them used their time to make stuff. I mean, it wasn't always nice artistic, they didn't think they were creating beautiful artworks, but they were just expressing themselves, I guess. And so using Heidelberg's reputation, Prinzhorn gathered I think a little over 5,000 pieces in the space of about 2 years. And he was astonished by the quality of it.
Not all 5,000 were amazing works of art.
Absolutely not. I mean, some of them. Some of them were kind of written diaries or music, and some of them had no kind of, I suppose, little value. But then some of them were just extraordinarily powerful, and they are still. I mean, you can go and see them in Heidelberg.
Maybe this is a time to, I know that you have a number of images in the book, and I know that we've talked about some of them briefly, but maybe
Yeah.
I'll share a few of them just so people out there can see some of the stuff, and maybe you'll just talk a little through who these people are,
Sure.
not too elaborately, but just let me see if I can pull it up so that people can see it.
Well, this is the hero of the book, who I was talking about, Franz Karl Bühler. He started off drawing sort of observational pictures of people in the asylum that he was in, but as he, you know, as his kind of term went on, if you like, and by this time he's about 20 years into his stay in Emmendingen, he started to draw self-portraits, and this is one of them. I mean, there's a few of them, and I mean, it's, you know, it's a kind of Van Gogh-esque, I would say. I mean, Prinzhorn kind of thought so as well. Just extraordinarily powerful and slightly disturbing.
Yeah.
This is actually Prinzhorn's favorite image. He put it on the frontispiece of the book that he produced about this collection. It's called Choking Angel in English. It's by Bühler again. And you can see there's a man sort of choking, lying on the floor, while this messenger of God sort of hangs over him with a clearly sinister intent. And given what happened to Bühler in the end, it's prescient, shall we say.
Am I right that you saw some of these works in person?
Yeah, I mean, this one is actually missing because it might have gone on the Degenerate art shows and got lost, but it's in the opening folio of Prinzhorn's book. The previous work I definitely saw, yeah. Elsa Blankenhorn she's one of the greatest artists in the collection. She does these kind of dreamy expressionist portraits, probably of herself. She was in the Bellevue Asylum, very wealthy bourgeois family, thought she was the spiritual wife of the Kaiser, which came with all sorts of responsibilities that she had to pay for. So she also painted banknotes to pay for her duties.
Wow.
August Natter is probably one of the most famous. He was an engineer who became psychotic and saw a vision over Stuttgart one day of a sort of a cloud that turned into a screen onto which he saw things projected. He said 10,000 images appeared on this screen in the space of about 20 minutes. And he spent the rest of his life trying to paint or draw the pictures that he'd seen on the screen. So I guess that's what this is. This was also, Max Ernst did a very similar work to this. This is, the next one is a Genzel. Genzel made little figurines out of wood that were probably from institutional beds. I mean, a lot of this stuff, they didn't have the material to work with, so they had to use what they had. But, you know, there was toilet paper or nursing rotors or whatever. And Genzel found his wood probably from, well, people think from you know, broken institutional beds. And this is called Hindenburg. It's a portrait of the famous German field marshal of the First World War. And he said, I think he said, he's got big ears so he can hear everything and a big nose so he can smell everything. But they're very sort of cartoony and funny and sort of sardonic, I suppose.
You talk about many more, but I'm going to stop there. But you talk about many more and include many more images in your book. And I mean, I'm not an art critic or very knowledgeable of art, but they're clearly impressive works. And Prinzhorn uses them, as you said, to publish a book that he comes out with, I think 1922, is that right? The Artistry of the Mentally Ill. Can you explain how important was that book? What was he trying to show in that book? What did it do for the art world?
Yeah, well, he was trying to produce a kind of art gallery in book form, I think, of the material that he had collected. And also, he writes very intelligently about it. His conclusions, you know, who the types of patients are. The centerpiece of it is a section in which he profiles what he calls 10 schizophrenic masters. And these are the people in the collection that he thinks are most valuable in artistic terms. And there are glorious illustrations of these, of all these works from lots of different artists in the collection. But the book became a really big hit among the avant-garde in Germany at the time. It was being passed around the Bauhaus. You know, Paul Klee had it. The people like Alfred Kubin, who was a kind of big Austrian expressionist artist, and it had a, you know, it had a strong impact because artists in the aftermath of the First World War were trying to explore madness. You know, if you think Dada, European Dada began in 1916 in the middle of the war, it was a kind of response to the war in that rationality had produced such catastrophic events, you know, millions, tens of millions of people being killed, trauma all over Europe, you know, mental illness all over Europe. And a lot of the artists themselves had actually fought in the war and had nervous breakdowns and so on. So after the war, there was this definite drive to looking at mental illness. You know, it's a schizophrenic age, they said, and it required a schizophrenic art. And so Prinzhorn's book sort of fell into this ideal scenario when insanity was completely in vogue. And it became source material for a lot of the famous names that we know now, like Max Ernst and Paul Klee. Max Ernst took it to Paris, where he was moving to set up a ménage à trois with a couple of surrealists. And it became the Bible of the surrealist movement. The circle around André Breton were trying to explore madness in their own way. And they used this as a sort of a source material, I guess you'd say, and ways to explore. You know, you've got, yeah, sorry, go on.
I was just going to say that Hitler comes in 1933 and his vision of art very different. Very different. What Hitler, I mean, you know, to say he's a cultural conservative is almost a joke, but I mean, he's you know, he's sort of stuck in a kind of late romantic period artistically. I mean, all his heroes are those kind of sort of highly technical, I guess you could say quite realist, but they're always painting mythical subjects. You know, that period around 1880 to 1910 of the kind of art academy art, that's the sort of art that Hitler thinks is art. And he thinks that this anything post 1910 basically is a sort of a sin almost. I mean, he calls Cubism and Dada the morbid excrescences of insane and degenerate men in Mein Kampf. And he picks up on this link between madness and art and uses it as a way to defame professional art, because he basically, I mean, we might go on to talk about this a bit more later, but he basically uses the connection with insanity to prove in his own sort of methods that professional modern art is insane itself, which means that it's degenerate. Yeah. Yeah, I definitely want to come back to that, but I see there's a question that maybe fits in here that somebody is posing, which is about Hitler's own background as a failed artist and how that fed into his understanding of art, his views of art. Was that a factor in shaping how he viewed modern art? I think it was. I mean, as everybody knows, he failed to get into the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, which, interestingly, people might not know, is a very sort of old-fashioned academy. Oskar Kokoschka was in Vienna at the time and was very rude about the academy. I mean, the academy was a place where people, it was a sort of all-male crowd, and they wore special uniforms and hats, you know, that looked artistic to try and make them feel more like artists. Well, that's what Kokoschka said.
So Hitler was trying to get into a very already kind of old-fashioned and slightly sterile kind of art world. And he was rejected from that because of the insufficiency of his own talent. I mean, his friend, Gustl Kubizek, his only childhood friend, said there was something about Hitler's work that it sort of lacked life. I mean, there's no humanity in it. He's very, very bad at people. And if you look through the kind of postcard copies that he did of those days in Vienna to make a living, and you look at the people, they're like marionettes. You know, they just don't look like they belong in the scene. But I mean, he did have some talent for the buildings and the architecture, and that's clearly where his true kind of, if he had an ability artistically, then that's probably where it lay. But he'd failed at various subjects at school and wasn't able to get into the architecture school either. So that really left him with no professional artistic career.
But he still believed that he was a talented artist, despite.
He did.
Yeah.
I mean, and he spent his life railing against the academies, who he said, you know, these old fart professors who didn't know what they were about, and I could teach them a thing or two about art, you know. And so I suppose his reaction to his rejection, and he applied twice to the Vienna Academy and rejected both times, was that he, you know, it pushed him down another path. He was incredibly stubborn and never took kind of no for an answer, never took anyone's assessment of him as being valid. And you know, it's argued by Thomas Mann, among others, that his entire political career was in a way a kind of artistic project. And you think of, I mean, Albert Speer makes this point as well, that all the kind of mise en scène, the productions, the marching men, the searchlights, the graphic design is all a sort of tapestry against which these Nazi characters kind of act out their awful existences, and that but there is, you know, Thomas Mann said, you've got to recognize there is an artistic quality about that, however hateful it is.
I have to admit, I found it was amazing when, I think it's towards the end of your book, where you talk about going to some military warehouse, American military warehouse, where various paintings brought back to the US from World War II are still stored, including some of Hitler's paintings, and you describe seeing some of those works.
It's a slightly freaky experience, I can tell you. There is in the kind of end of the war, the US Army sent out a kind of team. I mean, it's a bit like the Monuments Men, but they weren't safeguarding stuff. They were trying to seize propaganda art and bring it back, and sort of bring it to a storage point and then bring it back to the States. And there's a man named Captain Gilkey, who I think is an Oregonian painter in civilian life, who Roosevelt gave this job to of finding this stuff. And they had, I think 3 or 4 Hitler paintings that came from the Heinrich Hoffmann collection, Hoffmann being Hitler's photographer. And, you know, in Nazi Germany, these objects were traded like gold bullion. You know, if it was, I don't know, Goering's 50th birthday, then someone would present someone with a Hitler watercolor like it was a kind of great piece. But anyway, these are brought back to the US Army base outside Washington, which is where I went to see them, under extreme security, even in 2019.
I mean, there's a certain, I can certainly understand the rationale of not, you know, having these out on shows and things, and fearing that they would spark neo-Nazi support and things. But there's also a sense of, as you describe it, of kind of the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, where you know, there's some antiquity or these pieces of art that are just put in a box, put in a warehouse, sealed,
Yeah.
and off they go.
Yeah, they sit in this kind of gunmetal gray cabinet, and I had to go through, I mean, it's literally on an army base. And it took me months to get the security clearance. And then I had to be escorted through past all these kind of Humvees and discarded military vehicles, and then a whole new level of security after that. And,
Amazing.
I mean, yeah, bizarre.
Yeah. I guess it suggests the power of art and the power of that art to some degree, even still, the resonance that it might have. But I know we need to get to the Degenerate art exhibition that Hitler and the Nazis put on. And so can you tell us a little bit about why they decided to put that on and what it was?
Well, the part of Hitler's ideology was this theory of degeneracy, which was that a nation, I mean, it grew out of sort of race theory from the 19th century. But basically, there was a hierarchy of races, and the Aryan German was at the top of this hierarchy, but had become degenerated by influxes of sort of immigrants and cosmopolitanism and so on. And so modern art in that politics was degenerate art, meaning it was polluted, and it was sort of culturally poisoning the Germans. I think that's the best way of expressing it. So the Nazi idea was to put this material on show in contrast really to the show of officially sanctioned Hitler art. So Hitler built a great new art gallery in Munich in the Englischer Garten. It was the first big monumental Nazi building he commissioned in 1933. And that was to have all the great new Nazi approved Hitler art. And then across the road in this kind of very rundown little area called the Hofgarten Arcades, they were going to put all the shamed art, all the art from the time of decay, which is what they called the time of the Weimar Republic. So they went around Germany and hoovered up all this, what we would now think of as some of the best art in the 20th century, and put it on in this very cramped little gallery, along with captions saying, what the price of the work had been and which curator of which museum had actually bought it. The idea being to basically shame the curators for spending any money on what they called cultural Bolshevism. And then they packed on, they sort of laid on special transports to get people to the Degenerate art show. So the thing was incredibly crowded all the time. And there was a kind of mob of people trying to get through this door, which was too small. And the idea that this was, was that this was all a sort of, ghetto, Jewish, somehow, nasty. Whereas across the road, the kind of glorious light-filled halls where this terrible stuff that Hitler had approved was displayed in great isolation.
We're talking about the Degenerate art. Tell us some of the artists. This is like Van Gogh and Picasso and great artists that we would flock to today to see. Yeah,
Clay, Kokoschka. Germany before Hitler was a cultural powerhouse. It had some of the best. We probably had some of the best artists in the world at that time. German Expressionism was really a big deal on the global stage, but this was all that material, all the best of that material. And it was mainly German artists, but it also contained some of the big international French artists too.
There's something a little strange about the way you describe it. the numbers of people who go to that show, the Degenerate art show, which travels around, and you say at the end, this is the most viewed exhibition in world history. And yet they weren't going in the similar numbers to the, as you were just saying, to the kind of the good art. Was that because people liked the bad art, or was they wanted to see the kind of dirty stuff?
It's an interesting question. I think it's a bit of both. I think, you know, they call these shows sort of chambers of horrors, you know, and there was a sort of frisson about them of sort of, this is the stuff we're not supposed to see. You know, they had the Nazis put an age limit on the entrance of 18. So, you know, you had to be an adult to go and see it. They treated it like kind of pornography. But they never policed the age limit. I mean, it was just a way to kind of make it feel more kind of dirty and whatever. And I think there was a real sort of buzz around it. I mean, you know, if people who went to the great German art gallery, the official art gallery, really found it kind of sterile and boring. And I mean, the art in there was sort of Nazi heroic stuff. You know, it was powerful blonde Aryan men, or portraits of Hitler riding a kind of horse with a Nazi flag. I mean, even Hitler thought this stuff was pretty terrible. But in the Degenerate art shows, yeah, I mean, you had the theater of the staging itself, and then of course you had the really good art. So whether people were going to see, I don't think most people were going to see it because they thought, oh, really, I can see a great Picasso. I think most people were going for the experience of seeing this slightly kind of under the counter material. Yeah. But the Nazis also, they laid on all these transports, and they opened the show for late into the evening so that people could come from work and go and see them. And they toured the show around the Reich. So it began in Munich, but it went to Berlin and then all around until I think 1941.
Yeah, and you talk about how it changed, right? One of the changes significantly that you talk about is the inclusion of some of the Prinzhorn artists, particularly to highlight, and can you just go back? I know you talked about this before, but why include the Prinzhorn stuff in there?
Because they could write the caption then that said, this is a work by a genuine madman from a lunatic asylum. And it's even better than Oskar Kokoschka's terrible drawing that everybody once said was a great masterpiece. It was a kind of propaganda trick of juxtaposing the genuine mad people with the people who were trying to emulate the mad, with the idea that you show the modern artist wants to become a sort of subhuman. They have a yearning to be kind of Untermensch. They want to be mad. You know, they're dragging us all down into this kind of pyre of insanity and illness. That was the propaganda point.
One of the things that struck me was that you talk about how Prinzhorn early on sees these artworks by people in the various asylums and institutions as a sign of the fact that anybody can have a great artistic talent. It's not through training necessarily, but some people, regardless of where they are, they can create amazing art. And then Hitler also kind of uses that, but flips it in this Degenerate art by saying, the greatness of these Prinzhorn works make all the other artworks, it kind of brings them down. Where Prinzhorn was saying these show how there's a kind of equality, uplifting those works by people in the various asylums and such, whereas Hitler's saying those mean that all the other works that are impressionistic or such are brought down to the level of somebody who's insane. Is that fair, or am I capturing it?
Yeah, I think that's a fair characterization. I mean, Prinzhorn believed that at the height of Expressionism was about your ability to express what's inside you onto the paper or onto the sculpture. And the insane Prinzhorn proved, I suppose, was that we're able to express what was happening inside them, even these kind of major psychotic events. They had a real power of expression. So he rated them even higher than the professional artists who called themselves expressionists, because they had so much more to express. I mean, their interior was so much more interesting, I guess. Hitler wouldn't have said that the Prinzhorn artists were artists. I mean, he wouldn't have held them up. He didn't do that. I mean, he thought all of that stuff was rubbish. I mean, he, you know, there was a sort of right-wing psychiatrist who saw Prinzhorn's collection early on, and basically said that, you know, mad people can only express madness on the page. It's not art at all. You can't even classify it as art. I mean, that was a very controversial thing to say that this stuff was art. But Hitler's point, Goebbels' point, was that these people are useless, mad people. Their art is worth nothing. It's not even art. And look, the modernists, their art is even worse than that.
I want to get to the other component of what you write about, and that is the evolution of the Holocaust. And I know it's just one line, but it caught me, and I think you referred to it earlier, where I think you write about how Hitler's war on art and his cultural cleansing of Germany was a precursor to the racial cleansing of the Holocaust. And you move through this in a very kind of, you know, engaging way to talk about the so-called euthanasia program that first targets people in these insane asylums and people in various asylums, including many of these artists. Could you just tell us a little bit about that initial stage of the Holocaust?
Yeah, I mean, I make that point because I think as I said earlier, the ideology behind cultural cleansing is the same as behind ethnic cleansing. And I think that was the point of the cultural cleansing, was to prepare the ground for the cultural cleansing or the racial cleansing. And the idea is that, you know, in this social Darwinist way, Germany, the Volksgemeinschaft, you know, the pure German nation needs to get rid of the weaker members of society. And they had this idea of hereditary illness, that the mentally ill were, you know, almost all hereditary ill in some way. And, you know, you think the mentally ill in institutions at that time, I mean, some of them didn't have hereditary diseases at all. You know, I mean, some of them were alcoholics or just people who were politically inconvenient. But lay that aside for a second. But basically, the idea was that they would eradicate the genes of these bad genes from the German gene pool. So that meant initially, 1933, they started the sterilization campaign. They sterilized about 400,000 people by the end of the war. And a large number of those were in psychiatric institutions. And then I mean, the greater plan, which was there all along, was to do what they called euthanasia, but of course it wasn't. It was kind of murder. And to get rid of those who were seen as ballast existences or life unworthy of life, to use a couple of Nazi phrases. And in 1939, they started doing that. Hitler knew that it would be difficult in peacetime to do that because it was such a kind of, well, drastic measure to take. To
murder these people in these institutions.
Yeah, even in highly Nazified Germany in peacetime, that was going to be difficult. But once the war was declared, September the 1st, 1939, they pushed ahead with it really quickly. And by early 1940, they were gassing people. You know, I mean, in 1940, they gassed about 10,000 people at the first killing institution, 10,000 psychiatric patients in a place called Grafenegg, just outside Stuttgart, about 30 miles outside Stuttgart. And the principal artist, sorry, go on.
And you talk about how this kind of lays the groundwork, literally, the technology, the people involved, who then go on to the killing centers, the death camps, and use the same gassing techniques and the same obfuscations and you know, telling people you're going to a shower. They use that on these people who are in these various asylums, and then 2 years later, they're building Auschwitz. And it's those people and that experience that connects these two together. Am I right?
That's right. That's right. I mean, the hero of my story, Franz Karl Bühler, whose artwork we saw, he was killed in Grafenegg in 1940. And Grafenegg was the prototype killing plant, if you like. So they spent Hitler's private office and one of his personal doctors spent a few months at the end of 1939 just working out the system effectively. So they knew what they needed to be done to do. They knew what Hitler wanted, which was a way of murdering large numbers of people. And they experimented with various techniques. I mean, the first actual murdering techniques were tried at Brandenburg, just outside Berlin, on some psychiatric patients. And they first tried injecting them with overdoses, but it took too long. They gave the criminal police, the technical lab there, the job of finding a kind of killing agent that would work quickly. And they thought, well, carbon monoxide. They thought, well, initially they thought we could just pump it into the dormitories where the patients are sleeping at night, you know, and then they thought, well, that's not really going to work. And then they thought they could stage kind of massive train wrecks. You know, so they were sort of, if you like, brainstorming ways to kill people en masse. And then they had this trial gassing with carbon monoxide, which was, I suppose, cheap and easy to find and odorless and so on. And so they used Grafenegg as the sort of prototype. They converted this coach house into a gas chamber, which I think fitted about 40 people to start with. They expanded it later on, and they made it look like a shower. I mean, all these things, all these echoes, terrible echoes of later on. They pretended, so they bust the patients up here. They pretended they were being moved to a new institution, which again is a bit like the kind of death camps, I think. When they got into the Grafenegg, there was a reception room which was made out like a barracks with 100 made beds in this barracks, but no one ever slept in the beds. And then they had a sort of medical examination, it lasted about a minute, and the main objective was to find a plausible cause of death, you know, so they had to make up a cause of death later. And they wanted to check that if someone had had their appendix out, they wouldn't, you know, they knew that, so they wouldn't write that on the death certificate. They also wanted to know if they had gold teeth, and they would write an X on their back if they had gold teeth, because they would get those out later. And then they ushered them all, you know, they drove them all out of this barracks across the road to the coach house, crammed them all in, turned on the gas. And it was, I mean, the remarkable thing, I suppose, about this is that it was the doctors and the psychiatrists who were leading the way. You know, it was part of the Nazi plan that this would be presented as a kind of medical, you know, euthanasia was a kind of medical solution. It was a procedure, but of course it wasn't. But I mean, they co-opted doctors and psychiatrists into this.
And nurses, we do a program with nurses where we talk a lot about the euthanasia program. and the role of nurses who, we think of as caring, and yet, and you describe some of this, the nurses overseeing the starvation of patients. One of the other one of the other trial efforts at how to kill people was just to starve them. And or the fact that a nurse would be, holding a child or later some adult, and while the doctor is injecting them, or certainly guiding them to the gas chambers, the nurse is also, just the whole medical field, completely complicit in this, as they were later in the murder of Jews at the death camps.
I mean, they Nazified the system so much. I mean, they had these nurses called Brown Sisters who was, I suppose, especially Nazi in some way, and they were working on the transports, and just, I mean, they were, even the doctors found them nasty pieces of work, but they were terrible to the patients. And then, as you say, a lot of the actual people who worked on the euthanasia program then went on to the death camps later on.
We're coming to the end of our time, and I wanted to kind of, there were a couple of things I wanted to kind of connect through, and one of them, you talked a little about Buller, this artist who you start the book with in a very interesting way, talking about him as a successful guy who was doing steel work. I mean, artistry with as a blacksmith. And then we see some of his drawings, like the ones that I showed earlier, and then how he gets murdered. What happens to the Prinzhorn collection, and this gathering of art that this guy Prinzhorn collected over those years?
You mean at the end of the war, or do you mean?
Well, I mean, just what happened to it? It was used by the Nazis, as you said, to be incorporated into some of the Degenerate art exhibition. And then what happens to it after the war?
Well, it survived the war. I guess that's the miraculous thing. One of the miraculous things about the story is that almost all of the collection survived, probably because they might have wanted to use it for another propaganda show further down the line. But it's kind of, and then Heidelberg survived the war too, because I think the story goes that the Americans so loved Heidelberg that they couldn't bring themselves to bomb it. So it survived Heidelberg pretty much intact, and the collection survived. And then, in the 50s, Jean Dubuffet, who was one of the artists who'd seen Prinzhorn's book back in the 20s when he was living in Paris, and was kind of totally inspired by it, and said that, it made him believe that everything was possible in art. You could do absolutely anything you wanted. And after the war, he and André Breton got together and started a new art movement, which they called Art Brut, or raw art, which was sort of beginnings of what we later came to know as outsider art. It was art by psychiatric patients and people who weren't professionals. And it was a way of trying to take art out of the hands of an elite, a trained elite, and make it more democratic, I guess. And he went to Heidelberg and looked through the cupboards. I mean, he found these brown cupboards that are still there today, which is where the collection was stored. And he used a lot of the Prinzhorn artists in his own collection, which he then took to the States in the 50s, I think. And Jackson Pollock saw this collection, and Lee Krasner, and a lot of really serious American artists of the 20th century shared these kind of ideas with Dubuffet, I think you could say. And at the same time, it was getting more and more popular in Europe. It was put on in a big Swiss show in the 60s. And just kind of rediscovered, and at the same time, a psychiatric assistant in Heidelberg started to restore the collection and catalog it, and put on little shows of Prinzhorn material in art galleries in Heidelberg and so on, and so just more gradually it became more and more celebrated among the kind of avant-garde. And nowadays it's got its own art gallery since about 2001. still in Heidelberg. It's got a kind of small research library. There's a team of professional staff who look after it, and you can go and see this material.
You talk about the artists themselves, though, these patients who, because they were a kind of known group, that their deaths became searching for their deaths became a part of the kind of tracking of what happened, how the Nazis did things. Is that, I'm misremembering exactly, but
no, that's right. I mean, it's a slightly convoluted story, but basically, when this action to murder, the euthanasia action called Action T4, which killed about 70,000 psychiatric patients. As the war progressed, the Nazis had to move the headquarters of this place and the documentation, of which there was masses. Every patient was sent with their medical record to the killing station, and then the record was taken back to Berlin. So they had to move this kind of wealth of embarrassing evidence of their own mass murder activity. And by the end of the war, it ended up in East Germany. So it kind of fell into the hands of the Soviet army. And then it ended up in the Stasi Archive in East Germany, in East Berlin. So when, it was kind of locked away there, the Stasi using it for whatever nefarious purpose they had for it. And then come the fall of the Berlin Wall in '89, the Stasi Archive was opened up, and historians went into these rooms and found, I think there were 3 quite large rooms just full of records of people who'd been murdered in Action T4. So this was a kind of wealth of stuff, and they didn't really know even who to look for because they didn't know these people's names. But by that stage, they knew a lot of the Prinzhorn artists' real names, and so they started using them to go through this Stasi archive and find out, what had happened to them.
There's, obviously, it's, their treatment and the fact that they were murdered, all horrendous, but there's something nice about the justice of them being able to, their names being able to be used to clarify how people had been treated by the Nazis and to try and search for justice on behalf of all the victims of the Action T4. I thought it was a very nice way you brought it around. There is one question that I know we need to finish, but somebody's asking about whether Buhler was influenced by Munch and by the Scream, and I know you talk about this a little. Do we believe that there was any connection between Buhler's painting, that self-portrait that we started with, and
I don't think so. I have been asked this before. Buhler was sectioned in 1898. I think the Scream was, there are several versions, but I think it was the early 1890s.
Right.
And I think it's quite a slim chance that Buhler would have seen that before he was locked away, effectively. So I think the parallel is more to do with the subject matter than both trying to express similar sorts of feelings.
And I will say Buhler's, it is somewhat haunting, like the Scream.
Yeah.
Well, I know we have to wrap things up. Charlie, thanks so much for sharing your time and talking to me and to us about this book. And I'm not sure that I've conveyed it, but I really found it a super book. And I hope that those of you out there who have not had the chance, go and find a copy. It weaves together these various strands in a way that I don't think I've been able to elicit in our discussion, but really in a fabulous way. And so thanks so much, Charlie. Thank you out there for listening as well. And I hope everybody has a lovely evening. And Charlie, a good night.
Thank you very much, Thorin. It's been lovely talking to you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Be well.